9 years is a long time to watch your livelihood get choked out by gray, jagged stone. Every time the heavy trucks from the pipeline company roared past the north pasture, they left behind more than just dust. They left a trail of coarse, industrial gravel that spilled over the fence line, suffocating the clover and scarring the black dirt like a festering wound. For nearly a decade, Silas Thorne stood on his porch and watched them treat his ancestral acres like a common landfill. The company called it incidental runoff, a minor byproduct of progress that they had no intention of cleaning up. But Silas didn't scream, and he didn't beg. He just waited for the sun to drop low, grabbed his rusted wheelbarrow, and began to move. If you believe the land has a memory, subscribe to Beyond the Fields. Silas Thorne was about to prove that even a mountain of debt can be moved, one stone at a time. The soil in this corner of the county isn't just dirt. It's a living record of every hand that ever held a plow. Silas Thorne's grandfather had cleared these hills when the trees were thick as ship masts, and the only roads were the deer trails. He had pulled the white oak stumps with a team of oxen that breathed steam into the October frost, sweating and bleeding until the first 300 acres were tame enough to hold a seed. To a man like Silas, that history is written in the very tilt of the barn and the way the creek bed curves around the limestone shelf. It is a sacred trust, a legacy passed down through calloused palms and sun-parched skin. When the pipeline company first arrived with their yellow machines and their blue-inked maps, they didn't see a legacy. They saw a shortcut. They saw a path of least resistance across a valley floor that had been nurtured for over a century. To them, the land was a commodity, a line item on a spreadsheet. But to the people in the valley, Silas's farm was the heart of the community. It was the place where neighbors gathered to fix a broken harvester, and where the old-timers would sit on the tailgate of a truck to talk about the price of corn. When that first load of gravel tumbled off the side of a company access road and settled into the rich, dark silt of the lower meadow, it felt like a slap across the face of every man and woman who had ever broken their back for this earth. The silt was supposed to be the lifeblood of the farm. During the spring rains, the creek would overflow just enough to deposit a fresh layer of nutrients, making the grass green enough to make a cattleman weep with joy. But the gravel changed everything. It was dead stone, crushed granite that held no life and invited no growth. It tore the hooves of the livestock and broke the blades of the mowers. It sat there, cold and indifferent, a gray blemish on a sea of green. Silas's neighbors would pass by in their battered pickups, slowing down to see the old man standing by the fence. They saw the way his eyes searched the horizon, and they felt a shared sense of violation. It wasn't just Silas's field that was being buried. It was the idea that a man's property and his history meant something. The community watched as the company ignored the letters Silas sent and the calls he made. They saw the arrogance of the powerful, who assumed that a quiet farmer in faded denim would simply roll over and let his heritage be ground into the dust. But they didn't know Silas. They didn't understand that when you spend your life waiting on the seasons, you develop a patience that can outlast any corporate budget. Silas remembered his father telling him that the land always pays its debts, but you have to be there to collect. Every evening, when the work on the main farm was done and the shadows grew long across the valley, Silas would walk down to that scarred meadow. He would look at the gray stones and think about the generations of Thorns who had fought the wind, the drought, and the blight to keep this place whole. He felt the weight of their expectations in his very bones. The desecration wasn't just a physical nuisance. It was a spiritual wound that festered with every new truckload of gravel. He knew the company thought he was defeated because he wasn't shouting from the rooftops or filing lawsuits he couldn't afford. They mistook his silence for surrender. But Silas was a man who understood the slow, grinding power of the earth. He knew that even the mightiest river could be turned by a well-placed pebble if you had enough of them. He looked at the silt, once so rich and dark, now choked with the debris of industrial greed, and he made a silent vow to the men who had come before him. He would not let their work be erased by those who didn't know the smell of rain before it hit the dust. He would use their own waste against them. He would take every jagged piece of granite they threw away and turn it into a monument of his own making. The legacy of the Thorns wasn't going to end under a pile of gravel. It was going to be reinforced by it. As he picked up the first stone of the evening, a heavy piece of limestone the size of a loaf of bread, he felt a strange sense of peace. The fight wasn't going to be won in a courtroom or a boardroom. It was going to be won right here, in the dirt, through the steady, rhythmic application of a man's will. The community would see it, eventually. They would see that Silas wasn't just cleaning up a mess. He was building something that the suits in their air-conditioned offices could never understand. He was carving a new chapter into the silt, one that spoke of resilience and the quiet, unbreakable strength of a man who knows exactly where he stands. The 9 winters that followed would be hard, and the weight of the task would bow his shoulders. But Silas Thorne had the patience of the hills themselves. He knew that the land remembers every debt, and he was more than willing to wait for the day of reckoning. The executives from the pipeline company were men of polished shoes and quick smiles, the kind of men who carry the scent of expensive cologne and paper-thin confidence. To them, Silas Thorne was a character in a story they had heard 1,000 times before. He was the stubborn holdout, the relic of a dying era who didn't understand the inevitable march of progress. They arrived at his gate in sleek black SUVs that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of rusted wire and weathered cedar. The lead executive, a man named Miller, who wore a suit that probably cost more than Silas's best tractor, stepped out and looked around with a practiced air of condescension. He held a survey stake like a scepter, gesturing toward the North Ridge where the pipeline was being laid. Miller and his team didn't come to listen. They came to pacify. They offered Silas remediation fees and land use compensations, terms that were designed to make an old man feel like he was winning while they continued to dump their trash on his property. When Silas pointed out the growing mounds of gravel that were spilling from their access roads and into his prime grazing land, Miller just chuckled. He called it minor sediment displacement and promised that a crew would get to it eventually. To Miller, Silas's protests were a minor nuisance, a tiny pebble in the shoe of a billion-dollar project. He saw the farmer's weathered face and his grease-stained cap, and assumed he was looking at a man who could be easily bought or ignored. He didn't see the iron in Silas's eyes or the way his hands gripped the porch railing. The executives would sit in Silas's kitchen, drinking the coffee his wife Martha offered with a cold, silent grace, and they would talk about energy independence and economic growth. They spoke a language of abstractions, while Silas lived in a world of concrete realities, of hungry cattle, of dry wells, and of the gray stone that was slowly eating his field. One afternoon, Miller stood out in the field, his Italian loafers sinking into a patch of soft mud that the gravel hadn't reached yet. He looked at Silas and said, "Mr. Thorne, you have to look at the big picture. This pipeline is for the good of the state. A little gravel in a back pasture isn't going to change your life." Silas didn't answer right away. He just looked at the survey stake Miller had hammered into the ground, a bright orange marker that felt like a spear through the heart of the farm. Finally, Silas spoke in a voice that sounded like grinding millstones. "The big picture is made up of small pieces, Mr. Miller, and every piece you drop on my land is mine now." Miller laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed off the barn. He thought Silas was being poetic, or perhaps a little senile. He didn't realize it was a legal declaration. The executives viewed the survey stakes as the boundaries of their power, but to Silas, they were just markers of how far they had overstepped. They would leave behind their maps and their promises, driving away in a cloud of exhaust, confident that they had handled the peasant problem. They reported back to their headquarters that the farmer was quiet and wouldn't be an issue. They ignored the fact that Silas never cashed the checks they sent for land use. They ignored the fact that every time a truck dumped a fresh load of gravel, Silas was there within the hour, watching where it fell. The arrogance of the powerful is a strange thing. It blinds them to the strength of those they deem beneath them. Miller and his cohorts couldn't imagine a world where a man would value the integrity of his dirt over the comfort of a bank account. They saw Silas as a static object, something to be maneuvered around or paved over. They didn't see the movement in the dark. They didn't see the wheelbarrow tracks that began at the edge of the gravel spill and led toward the deep, hidden ravine on the far edge of the property. They were so focused on the horizon and the next quarter's earnings that they failed to look at what was happening under their very noses. To them, the gravel was gone once it fell off the truck. It was no longer their problem. They didn't understand that for Silas, the problem was just getting started. He watched them from the shadows of his barn, a man of iron and silence, letting their insults and their arrogance wash over him like water over a stone. He let them believe they were the masters of the valley, while he slowly, methodically, began to reclaim the materials they were so carelessly discarding. The survey stakes stayed in the ground, bright and mocking, but Silas knew they wouldn't stay there forever. He knew that the suits and the polished shoes would eventually go back to the city, leaving behind the mess they had made. And he knew that he would be the one left to deal with it. The executives thought they were buying silence, but all they were doing was providing Silas with the raw materials for a reckoning they couldn't possibly foresee. Every time Miller smiled and patted Silas on the shoulder, he was digging the hole for his own company a little deeper. The arrogance of the wealthy is a heavy burden, and Silas was more than happy to help them carry it to its natural conclusion. He stood at the edge of his field, watching the taillights of the SUVs fade into the distance, and felt the weight of the first stone in his hand. The suits were gone for now, but the gravel remained, and Silas Thorne had work to do. The work crews were different from the executives. They were men of sweat and loud talk, guys who wore neon vests and spent their days operating the massive excavators and dump trucks that tore through the landscape. To them, Silas Thorne was a joke, a local curiosity they called the rock picker. They would lean out of the cabs of their idling trucks, spitting tobacco juice into the dust, and watch as Silas spent his evenings bent double in the meadow. They saw him picking up the gravel stone by stone, loading it into a rickety wooden wheelbarrow, and hauling it off toward the thick brush of the creek line. They'd hoot and holler, making bets on how long it would take the old man to clear a single square yard. "Hey, Silas!" one of them would yell, his voice carrying over the rumble of the engines. "We got another 10 tons coming in tomorrow. Want us to drop it right in your barrow to save you the walk?" They'd roar with laughter, the kind of cruel mirth that men use to distance themselves from a task they know is wrong. They saw a man who looked broken by the very land he claimed to love. To them, Silas was a fool who was trying to hold back the tide with a plastic bucket. They didn't see the muscle beneath the faded flannel or the way his movements were as steady and practiced as a clock's gears. Silas never looked up. He never gave them the satisfaction of a middle finger or a shouted curse. He just kept his head down, his gloved hands moving with a relentless, terrifying efficiency. He would find a large chunk of granite, heft it into the barrow, and then fill the gaps with smaller stones, packing them in until the wooden frame groaned under the weight. Then he would push. He pushed through the mud of the spring thaws and the choking dust of the August droughts. He pushed until his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, and then he pushed some more. The workers would sit in their air-conditioned brake trailers, eating their sandwiches and watching him through the windows. They thought he was doing their job for them, cleaning up the spill so they wouldn't have to hear the bosses complain. They mocked his obsessive-compulsive nature, making jokes about how he probably counted the stones in his sleep. They didn't notice that as the years went by, the pile of gravel in the meadow never really seemed to get smaller. But Silas's path to the creek grew more and more reinforced. They were so caught up in the ease of their own power that they couldn't recognize a man who was building a life's work out of their garbage. One younger worker, a kid who hadn't been on the job long enough to lose his soul, once walked over to Silas during a lunch break. He offered the old man a bottle of water and asked, "Why do you do it, Mr. Thorne? Why don't you just let us bring a skid steer in here for an hour and scrape it all up?" Silas stopped for a moment, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind the boy. "Because your machines don't know where the stones belong," Silas said softly. "They just know how to move them. I'm putting them where they need to stay." The kid walked away, shaking his head, and the older guys just laughed harder. They didn't understand that Silas was a man of iron and silence, and that silence is where the most dangerous plans are hatched. They continued to treat the field like a dumping ground, being even more careless with their loads because they knew the rock picker would clean it up by morning. They were literally handing Silas the ammunition he needed, and they were laughing the whole time they did it. The company even started using Silas as a talking point in their community outreach meetings. They'd tell the local council how neighborly the relationship was, pointing out that Mr. Thorne was so dedicated to his land that he personally tended to the areas near the construction site. They turned his struggle into a PR win, all while their trucks continued to grind his heritage into the dirt. But the mockery had a way of fueling Silas. Every laugh from a foreman, every sneer from a driver, was just another reason to keep his back bent and his hands moving. He wasn't just moving stone, he was moving his anger. He was taking the disrespect and the arrogance of these men and burying it in the earth. He knew that the day would come when the laughing would stop, and he wanted to make sure that when it did, the silence that followed would be deafening. The workers saw a pathetic old man wasting his final years on a fool's errand. Silas saw a company that had forgotten that the man who owns the dirt ultimately owns the destiny of everything built upon it. He watched the seasons change 9 times, his hair turning the color of the very granite he hauled, and his silence became a wall that no corporate mockery could penetrate. He was a farmer made of iron, tempered in the fire of their disdain, and he was nearly finished with his work. For 9 years, Silas Thorne had been a ghost on his own land, a shadow moving in the twilight. But as the 10th winter approached, the fruit of his labor began to take a shape that was impossible to ignore, if anyone had bothered to look. Hidden behind a dense screen of willow and wild rose, at the narrowest point of the deep ravine that bordered the pipeline's main access road, Silas had been engineering a masterpiece. This wasn't just a heap of discarded rock. It was a dry-stack stone dam, built with the precision of an ancient cathedral. Silas had used the larger chunks of granite as the foundation, wedging them deep into the clay of the ravine floor until they hit the bedrock. He had then spent years layering the smaller stones, hand-fitting each one so that they locked together in a tight, impenetrable weave. He didn't use mortar or cement. He used the weight of the stones themselves and the natural pressure of the earth. He understood the physics of water and the stubbornness of gravity. He had built the dam with a subtle, upstream curve, a design that would actually grow stronger as water pushed against it. He had created bypass channels and internal spillways made of smaller pebbles to manage the minor runoff, keeping the structure hidden from anyone who wasn't looking for it. To the pipeline workers, the area was just a drainage feature on their maps, a place they assumed would naturally carry away the overflow from their paved roads and culverts. They never noticed that the ravine was slowly being filled by a wall of stone that was now 20 feet high and 40 feet wide at its base. Silas had meticulously covered the exterior of the dam with local sod and brush, making it look like a natural ridge or a forgotten landslip. It was a slow stacking of truth, each stone a testament to a year of being ignored, each layer a record of a corporate lie. While the company was busy celebrating the completion of their latest expansion, Silas was finishing the capstones. He spent weeks finding the perfect, flat slabs of limestone to lock the top layer in place. He worked until his fingers bled, but he felt no pain. He felt only the immense, crushing weight of the truth he had built. He knew that the pipeline company had taken shortcuts with their own drainage systems. They had built a massive illegal access road that cut across the natural slope of the hill, a road they used to bypass the weight limits on the county bridges. This road acted like a funnel, gathering all the rainwater from the North Ridge and aiming it directly toward Silas's lower fields. In their arrogance, they had assumed that Silas's ravine would just act as a bottomless sink for their runoff. They hadn't accounted for a man who could move mountains with a wheelbarrow. Silas stood atop his creation in the fading light of a November evening. The dam felt like part of the earth itself, a silent guardian waiting for the sky to break. He thought about the executives in their suits and the workers in their trucks. They lived in a world of quick fixes and temporary solutions. They built things to last for a fiscal quarter or a contract cycle. Silas had built this to last forever. He had turned their waste into a weapon of pure physics. He knew that the weather was changing. The old-timers in the valley were talking about the big one, the kind of storm that only comes once in a generation, when the atmospheric rivers align and the clouds dump months of rain in a matter of hours. The company's engineers had looked at the historical data and decided the risk was statistically insignificant. They hadn't built their road for a 100-year flood. They had built it for a profit margin. Silas, however, had built his dam for the truth, He knew the water was coming, and he knew exactly where it would go. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction as he looked down at the pipeline road, a gray ribbon of gravel and packed earth that sat directly in the path of the diversion he had created. For 9 years, they had dumped their problems on him. Now he was ready to return them with interest. He walked back to his farmhouse, his steps light despite his age. The stacking was done. The truth was hidden in plain sight, a massive, silent weight that would soon make itself known to the world. Silas Thorne went to bed and listened to the first few drops of rain hit the tin roof. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, the beginning of a long-overdue conversation between the sky and the stone. The storm didn't arrive with a roar. It began with a relentless, soaking drizzle that turned the hills into sponges. But by midnight, the wind shifted, and the sky opened up with a violence that hadn't been seen in the valley for 50 years. The rain wasn't falling in drops. It was falling in sheets, a cold, heavy deluge that turned the dry creek beds into churning torrents of mud. On the North Ridge, the pipeline company's illegal access road began to fail almost immediately. The culverts they had installed, too small and too cheap, were quickly choked with debris. The water, denied its intended path, began to follow the contours of the land, gathering speed and volume as it raced down the slope. It was a wall of liquid energy, carrying with it branches, topsoil, and the very gravel the company had used to pave their way. It headed straight for Silas Thorne's ravine, exactly as the company engineers had predicted. But when the flood hit the mouth of the ravine, it didn't find an open drain. It found Silas's wall. The stone dam stood like a fortress, silent and unyielding against the onslaught. The water hit the granite face with a sound like a freight train, spray leaping 20 feet into the air as the pressure mounted. Silas sat in his darkened kitchen, a single candle burning on the table, and he felt the vibration in the floorboards. He knew the dam would hold. He had built it with the weight of 9 years of patience. As the ravine filled, the water reached the bypass channels Silas had engineered. Instead of flowing through his lower meadows and drowning his livestock, the flood was forced back. The upstream curve of the dam did exactly what it was designed to do. It redirected the massive force of the water sideways, pushing it back up against the ridge. The water had nowhere to go but out, spilling over the banks of the ravine and onto the pipeline company's access road. The road, which had been built on a foundation of arrogance and shortcuts, didn't stand a chance. The diverted floodwater acted like a hydraulic ram, scouring the road from the inside out. The very gravel that the company had dumped on Silas's land for a decade was now being washed away by the thousands of tons carried by the diverted current and dumped directly into the pipeline's own main construction trench. The irony was poetic and devastating. The company's sediment displacement had finally come home to roost. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a gray mist, and the sound of rushing water had settled into a low growl. Silas put on his boots and walked out to the edge of the ridge. The scene was one of total industrial ruin. The access road was gone, replaced by a jagged canyon of raw clay. The main pipeline trench, which had been ready for the final inspection, was now a mile-long swamp of mud and gray gravel. The expensive machinery they had left on the ridge was tilted at impossible angles, half buried in the debris. But Silas's farm was pristine. The lower meadow, once choked with gravel, had been shielded by the dam. The water that had managed to trickle through was clear, filtered by the very stones that had once been a nuisance. Silas looked down at the wreckage of the company's progress and saw Miller, the executive, standing by the edge of the washout. Miller's suit was ruined, his polished shoes caked in the thick red mud of the valley. He looked at the massive stone structure that had appeared out of nowhere, and then he looked at Silas. There was no mockery left in his eyes, only a hollow, stunned realization of what had happened. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That Silas had moved too much rock? That he had been too careful with the trash they had given him? Silas didn't say a word. He just stood there, a man of iron and silence, watching as the company's hubris was washed away. The land had reclaimed what was hers, using the very tools the invaders had provided. The water had stopped flowing, but the message was loud and clear. The debt had been paid in full, and the soil had a long, long memory. The pipeline company tried to sue, of course. They sent their lawyers to argue that Silas had built an illegal structure, but the case fell apart before it even reached a judge. Silas simply produced the 9 years of certified letters he had sent, documenting every truckload of gravel and every request for its removal. He showed that he had merely consolidated the company's abandoned materials on his own property to prevent environmental damage. The stone dam wasn't an obstruction. It was a monument to their negligence. In the end, the company had to pay millions to clear their own gravel out of their own trench, and they were forced to pave a proper, legal road far away from the Thorne property. Silas Thorne still walks his fields every evening. The dam is still there, a gray spine of granite that has now been overtaken by moss and fern, looking like it has been part of the landscape since the dawn of time. It stands as a reminder that the world may be fast, but the earth is slow. It teaches us that patience is a form of power, and that if you have enough of it, you can turn even the heaviest burden into a foundation for justice. The soil remembers every debt, and Silas Thorne is the man who made sure it was collected. In the quiet of the valley, the land finally breathes free.